The shadow didn't just fall, it plummeted. It hit the marble balcony floor with a sound like a slab of meat being thrown onto a butcher's block. Heavy, solid, and terrifyingly fast. I didn't scream. Wolters are trained to skip the vocalizations and go straight to the tactical assessment. But as the creature uncoiled from its crouch, my tactical assessment was screaming one word: impossible. It looked human, but the proportions were skewed. Its limbs were too long, its fingers tipped with nails that had been filed into obsidian points. It wore a tactical vest over dark clothing, but there was no weapon in its hands. It didn't need one. The way it breathed, a low, rattling hiss that sounded like air through a predator's lungs, told me that its body was the only weapon the Volkovich elders had deemed necessary. Alexander's grip on my arm tightened to the point of bruising, but I welcomed the pain. It was a tether to reality while the world was turning into a horror movie. "Behind me, Sasha," Alexander growled. "In your dreams, Alexander, I'm wearing 4-inch heels. I'm already a liability. I'm not playing the damsel, too." I kicked off my shoes. The cold stone of the balcony met my bare feet, and for a second, I felt a literal connection to the earth. The fever in my blood surged, a white-hot tide of adrenaline that sharpened the world into high definition. I could see the individual fibers of the creature's vest. I could see the way its pupils dilated as it focused on Alexander. The creature lunged. It didn't move like a person. It moved like a blur of gray and black. Alexander met it halfway. There was no finesse, no boardroom etiquette. And it was a collision of raw power. Alexander caught the creature's wrists, his muscles bulging through the fabric of his tuxedo. The stone beneath them seemed to groan. "Marcus, get her to the elevator," Alexander roared over his shoulder. "The elevators are dead, sir," Marcus cried from the doorway. He was holding a heavy bronze bust of some long-dead poet, looking ready to swing it at anything that moved. "They cut the power to the main grid. We're on emergency lighting only." The creature let out that sharp, whistling hiss again. From the roof above, 3 more shadows shifted. "Alexander, we're being flanked," I yelled. I didn't wait for his permission. I grabbed a heavy wrought iron chair from the balcony set, a piece of furniture that should have weighed 50 pounds, and swung it with a strength that made my own bones ache. And I caught the creature in the side of the head just as it tried to sink its teeth into Alexander's shoulder. The metal crumpled. The creature didn't die, but it staggered, its silver eyes flickering with momentary confusion. "The service stairs," Alexander panted, shoving the creature back with a force that sent it skidding across the marble. He grabbed my hand, and this time, I didn't fight him. "The museum has a reinforced freight lift in the basement for the artifacts. If we can get there, we can override the lock." We bolted back into the ballroom. The scene was a nightmare in emerald and gold. The ton was no longer a collection of the city's elite. They were a panicked herd. Tables were overturned, champagne was spilled across the floor like blood, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and fear. Yet the emergency lights flickered on, casting long, rhythmic shadows that made every movement look like a threat. We ran through the chaos, Alexander leading the way like a battering ram. He didn't even slow down for the obstacles, simply shouldering his way through the heavy oak doors that led to the staff corridors. The transition was jarring. We went from the velvet-lined opulence of the museum to the cold, sterile reality of the back hallways, fluorescent lights, concrete floors, and the smell of industrial cleaner. "How many are there?" I asked, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. My heart was thumping a rhythm that felt like a war drum. "My father's hounds usually operate in packs of 6, Alexander said, not slowing his pace. "They aren't werewolves, Sasha, not in the way your grandfather's stories say. They're biological experiments, high-level conditioning, chemical enhancements, and a selective breeding program that the Volkovichs have been running for 50 years. They call it reclaiming the legacy." "So they're just very fast, very angry men?" I asked, trying to ignore the way my own senses were continuing to heighten. The smell of the industrial cleaner was becoming so pungent, it was making my eyes water. "They're predators, Sasha, and they've been told that you and I are the only things standing between them and the Wolters Volkovich inheritance." We hit the stairwell. Marcus was right behind us, still clutching his bronze poet. We descended the stairs 3 at a time, the sound of our footsteps echoing up and down the concrete shaft. Then I heard it, a scratching sound from the walls. "They're in the vents," I whispered. How can you hear that? Alexander asked, glancing at me. I don't know, I just can. Alexander, they're above us. A ceiling grate 10 feet ahead of us exploded downward. One of the hounds landed in a perfect 3-point stance, its silver eyes fixed on me. It didn't whistle this time. It growled, a deep chest vibrating sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. Alexander stepped in front of me, but I was already moving. I felt a surge of cold, calculated fury. This was my city, this was my night. And I was tired of being hunted. I didn't have a weapon, but I had the environment. To our right was a heavy fire extinguisher mounted to the wall. I ripped it from its bracket and, without thinking, pulled the pin. I didn't spray the creature. I threw the entire canister at its feet and kicked the nozzle as hard as I could. But the white chemical foam exploded upward, creating a blinding, choking cloud. The hound shrieked, a sound that was far too animal to be human. Go, I screamed, grabbing Alexander's arm. We dived past the blinded creature and through the door at the bottom of the stairs. We were in the museum's basement now, a labyrinth of crates, plastic-wrapped statues, and heavy climate control machinery. It was dark, the only light coming from the red exit signs and the occasional flickering emergency bulb. The freight lift is at the end of the north corridor, Alexander said, his voice tight. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, the dark red liquid stark against his pale skin. We wove through the crates. This was the storage for the damned, artifacts too controversial or damaged to be on display. A huge stone sarcophagi loomed like ghosts in the dark. Headless Greek statues stood guard over piles of bubble wrap. We were halfway to the lift when Alexander stopped. He pulled me into the shadow of a massive wooden crate labeled Fragmentary Relics. Do not open. What is it? I breathed. Hush, he commanded. In the silence, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, but they weren't the frantic, heavy steps of the hounds. They were slow, measured, the sound of expensive leather on concrete. A light clicked on at the far end of the corridor. A man was standing there. He was older, his hair a shock of white, his suit as impeccably tailored as Alexander's. He held a silver-topped cane in one hand and a tablet in the other. Alexander, the man said. His voice was like dry parchment. You always did have a penchant for the dramatic. I'm running to the basement. It's a bit cliché, don't you think? Father, Alexander spat. Osric Volkovich stepped into the light. Behind him, 3 hounds stood like statues, their silver eyes reflecting the glow of his tablet. And Miss Walters, Osric said, turning his gaze to me, you look just like your mother. She had that same look of indignant fury right before we buried her. The fever in my blood didn't just rise, it detonated. I stepped out from behind Alexander, my hands curling into fists. You talk about my mother again, Osric, and I'll show you exactly how Walters I can get. Osric chuckled. The girl has teeth. I see why you're enamored, Alexander. But this setup of yours, it's a threat to the purity of the Volkovich line. We don't merge with the weak. We absorb them. There's nothing weak about her. You know, Osric, Alexander said, stepping up beside me. He didn't look like a son talking to a father. He looked like a rival alpha protecting his mate. And there's nothing pure about your hounds. They're monsters in suits, just like you. Monsters are the only things that survive the coming shift, Alexander. Your grandfather knew it. Sasha's grandfather knew it. The blood is calling, and you're trying to drown it in champagne and contracts. Osric tapped a button on his tablet. The hounds behind him didn't lunge. They began to hum. It was a low-frequency sound that vibrated through the floor, through my feet, and straight into my nervous system. It was an agonizing, high-pitched resonance that felt like it was trying to peel my skin off from the inside out. I slumped against the crate, my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside me. And beside me, Alexander fell to his knees. He let out a strangled roar, his hands clawing at the concrete. What is that? I gasped. A frequency, Osric said calmly, tuned specifically to the Walters and Volkovich genetic markers. It's designed to trigger the surge prematurely. If your bodies aren't ready, your hearts will simply stop. If you are what I think you are, well, then the party truly begins. The pain was blinding. I felt my vision start to turn red. My heart was beating so fast it felt like a continuous vibration. I looked at Alexander. His eyes were no longer amber. They were a terrifying molten gold. His jaw was shifting, his teeth looking sharper, his muscles expanding until the seams of his tuxedo began to pop. Alexander, stop it, I cried, reaching out to him. But I felt it too, and my own bones felt like they were being reshaped by a hammer. My nails were digging into my palms, drawing blood. I looked down at my hands. The skin was pale, but the veins were turning a dark, pulsating blue. I wasn't changing into a wolf. I was changing into something faster. Stop! The sound! Alexander managed to choke out. I looked at Osric. He was watching us with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a chemical reaction. He didn't care if we died. He just wanted to see what we were. I didn't use logic. I didn't use a plan. I used the surge. I pushed off the crate with a force that sent the heavy wood splintering backward. I didn't run. I transitioned from point A to point B in a way that defied the laws of physics. I was across the corridor before Osric could blink. I didn't punch him. I grabbed the silver-topped cane and twisted. The metal snapped like a twig. I grabbed the tablet from his hand and smashed it against the concrete floor. The humming stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood over Osric, my chest heaving, my vision slowly returning to normal. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from power. Osric looked up at me, a trickle of blood running from a small cut on his cheek, where a piece of the tablet had hit him. He wasn't afraid. He was smiling. "Remarkable," he whispered. "You triggered without the full transition. Your blood is purer than your father's ever was." Alexander was standing up now. He looked different. His tuxedo was ruined, his shirt torn open to reveal a chest that looked like it had been carved from granite. He walked toward us, his movement so smooth it was eerie. "Get away from her, Osric," Alexander said. His voice was no longer human. It was a low, resonant rumble that made the crates around us vibrate. "Or what, Alexander? You'll kill your own father in front of your new bride?" Osric stood up, brushing off his suit. "You've proven my point. You aren't businessmen. You are alphas. And the city is your territory. But you aren't the only ones who woke up tonight." Osric looked past us, toward the shadows at the end of the hall. "The Alzaranis didn't just want your company, Sasha. They wanted the blood too. And they've hired someone to make sure the Walters line ends tonight." A new sound echoed through the basement. It wasn't a hiss or a whistle. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a heartbeat, so loud it sounded like a drum. And from the darkness of the north corridor, a figure emerged. He was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and he wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing heavy leather and chains. His eyes weren't silver or gold. They were a flat, dead black. He didn't look like a hound. He looked like an executioner. "Meet the butcher," Osric said, stepping back into the shadows. "He doesn't care about frequencies. He only cares about the hunt." The giant stepped into the light, and I realized he wasn't alone. Behind him, a dozen more hounds emerged, their silver eyes fixed on us with a renewed, hungry intensity. Alexander stepped up beside me, his hand finding mine. His grip was no longer hot. It was searing. "Sasha," he whispered. "I know," I said. "We can't fight them all here." "I know." I looked at the giant, then at the freight lift behind us. The fever in my blood was reaching a boiling point. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. "Alexander," I said, looking at the giant. "On 3? On 3. The giant let out a roar that shook the very foundation of the museum. 1, 2, 3. We didn't lunge at the giant. We turned and sprinted for the freight lift. Alexander slammed his fist into the emergency override button, and the heavy steel doors began to groan shut. The giant was fast, unnervingly fast for his size. He reached the lift just as the doors were inches apart. He slammed his massive hands into the gap, the steel screeching as he began to pry the doors back open. I looked into those dead black eyes. Then I looked at the control panel. "Alexander, the counterweight," I yelled. Alexander understood instantly. He didn't try to push the doors. And he grabbed the heavy manual winch above our heads and pulled with every ounce of his surge strength. The lift didn't go up. It dropped. The giant's hands were still caught in the doors as the lift plummeted into the sub-basement levels. There was a sickening sound of metal shearing and bone snapping. The giant let out a scream that was cut short as the lift hit the bottom with a bone-jarring thud. We were in total darkness. "Alexander," I gasped, coughing through the dust. "I'm here." A light clicked on, Alexander's phone. He was covered in soot and blood, but his eyes were still glowing that terrifying gold. We were in a small, cramped sub-basement. There was only one door. Alexander pushed it open. We weren't in the museum anymore. We were in a tunnel, a brick-lined ancient passage that smelled of damp earth and old secrets. "So the old transit tunnels," Alexander whispered. "They run under the whole city." We started to walk, our footsteps echoing in the dark. But we hadn't gone 10 feet before I stopped. I felt a cold breeze, and I smelled something, Not industrial cleaner, not cedar wood. I smelled the forest. I looked at the brick wall to our left. There was a small iron-grated window at the top. I pulled myself up to look out. We weren't under the city anymore. The tunnel had let us out, rising with the geography of the hill. We were looking out over the edge of the city, toward the dark, dense woods of the Walters estate. And standing at the edge of the tree line, illuminated by the full moon that had finally broken through the clouds, was a woman. She was wearing a tattered white dress. Her hair was long and wild. She was holding a lantern that glowed with a soft, natural light, a flame that didn't flicker in the wind. She looked exactly like the portrait of my great-grandmother. She raised the lantern, her eyes meeting mine across the distance. She didn't say a word, but I heard her voice in my head as clearly as if she were standing next to me. The hunt has only just begun, Sasha. Welcome home. Behind us, in the tunnel, we heard the sound of the freight lift doors being torn off their hinges. The Hounds had found the sub-basement. I looked at Alexander. He looked at the woods. Into the trees, he asked. Into the trees, I said. We climbed out of the grate and began to run toward the darkness. But as we hit the first line of trees, the ground beneath us didn't just feel like dirt. It felt like it was breathing. And the moon? The moon wasn't white anymore. It was turning a deep, pulsating silver.
That brings us to the end of this episode. If you haven't already, subscribe and hit the notification bell to get quick notification of episode 4, where Sasha and Alexander must survive the night in the Walters woods, while the myth of their blood finally begins to manifest in ways they can no longer deny. Stay fierce, Z.